lecture today is the first lecture, hopefully in a series for a degree that is a first of its kind. This is the first undergraduate degree in urban technology in the US and in the world that we know of, at least. We've looked pretty exhaustively. There's one other program in the US at Cornell Tech, which is a master's degree. And for us, this is a great opportunity to think about how we want to start. And so we'll get to that. But what we did before was welcome George A. here from Chicago. Okay, so we'll do that again. Welcome. Okay, so to set up the talk, what I would like to do is share some things that I know, and perhaps you know also. So I know that the climate is warming. I know that cities are growing. I know that urban challenges are wicked challenges. I know that technology has always been part of urban life. I know that so-called smart cities are not the answer to whatever your question is. I know that urban technologies are designed and not just engineered. But I also know that human-centered design is not enough. It's not up to the task. Architecture and planning, the things that we do in our half of this building, are also not enough on their own. I know that we cannot move fast and break things in cities, and we cannot wait any longer to fix broken systems, either the hard systems like infrastructure or the soft ones like our democratic institutions. The design of new products and services is also the design of new experiments in urban life, and this is a subject of the design work that we want to do in the degree, experiments in urban life and urban governance. And I know that it is impossible to do this work without self-awareness and a sound ethical position. So this very first lecture is a talk on the ethics of design, not the ethics of technology, right? Even though that's in the title of the degree, but actually the ethics of doing new things. So how shall we design in a way to reduce or eliminate harm? How shall we design in a way that matches our values? How shall we be conscientious as designers? These are the kinds of questions that are on the forefront of our minds. And we welcome George to the University of Michigan this evening because there's another thing that I know for sure. On this subject of design and ethics, George is one of the most thoughtful people among us. So George is the co-founder of Greater Good Studio in Chicago. They focus on people-centered social change, and it sounds like there are some folks who are familiar, which is great. George and his colleagues have created things like a new cafeteria experience for school children in Chicago, as well as facilitating the design of Rwanda's first point-of-care digital health records. And between these two examples, pulled from the website almost at random, you can see that there's quite a spread in Greater Good's work. It's diverse and important, and what unifies the work is a commitment to positive social impact and a rigorous design process that begins with research. So if we have any Taubman students who are lucky enough to snag a seat in the workshop tomorrow and Sunday, you'll get more on that soon. George's career spans IDEO, Chicago Transit Authority, IA Collaborative, and I learned this just last night, even a short stint at Mark Newson's office, which most people will know as the designer of the Apple Watch.
Deep cuts, that one. Yeah.
Deep cuts.
Yeah.
So today, in addition to practice, George is also a professor at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. It teaches social innovation. So please welcome self-proclaimed pissed off optimist, George A.
That was like worth the whole trip. That was such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. And that is a very kind way of introducing the talk. I'm so excited to be able to be here. You gave me an excuse to wear a tie. I'm thrilled. I actually miss in-person experiences so much. And I actually think that there's a bunch of people online. So hello, and internet people. But I'm going to try to focus on the folks that are actually here. So thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to talk about this topic area, and it's cautious, and I'm a little cautious because I want to not come across as an expert on ethics. But I am very familiar with being caught out by the ethical moments that I've seen in my career. So I would say I'm very familiar with that. Does that make me an expert? Probably not. But I think that my lack of familiarity is something that I want to address by talking about it a bunch And I want to be able to have folks join me on that journey, because I think you probably might also find yourself kind of caught out. And I'd hate for you to be so unprepared as I was. So just to kind of frame what we'll be speaking about today. I'll be expecting feedback from you at some point. So if you have thoughts about what we talked about, how I presented and the discussion as a whole, I appreciate hearing from you now or at some point in the future over the internet. Just to kind of maybe introduce myself, my name is George A. I'm the co-founder and director of innovation at Greater Good Studio. We're based in Chicago, and we're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary. We are thrilled to still be in business after 10 years. And it's only notable just because for us, focusing exclusively on the social sector, which means working with nonprofits, foundations, and government, we didn't think that necessarily would have made for a commercial design business the way we had. But I'm really glad to say that we're still here doing it. And that singular focus on those topic areas, I'd like to prove that it's a real thing. It can be a thing that you can do as well. You don't have to have the common narrative that I'd always heard of doing design in the social sector to always be a hackathon or like a gift, like some sort of like a something to pay down. And I feel like that's something we want to just kind of establish. It's a thing you can do every day. We've been fortunate in that we've been able to apply a lot of the work that we've done in other areas from commercial design, and this process of understanding humans and their needs and then designing responses to them across a number of different topic areas. And the ones that we show here are quite varied. But the root of many of these turns out to be probably three big structural components of how this country was built around patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. They tend to be remixed again and again and again and show up like these projects. So at the root of all of these tend to be those three large tenants. And we are constantly trying to work out what is the version, what's the flavor of those three in different proportions in the projects that we work on today. And we do it because we think that there's a shared sense in our team that we think design can be restorative. It could be more than just awesome and cool and make tangible things and all the things that you typically think about what design can do. But the idea of it being restorative is a little provocative to us because I'm not sure if we totally know what that word means. But in the root of it, I think it's because we think that something could be put back in place. We think that there's something a little broken and that perhaps there's a role for us to kind of restore what was misaligned. But before we can do that, I think it's important for us to perhaps acknowledge the harm that design can and has done and might continue to do if we don't take stock of it. I don't think we can afford to continue to just be cheerleaders. And to pick up from what Brian was describing in courses like this, there is this growing sense that perhaps by taking stock of where we've been, we might shift the trajectory of where we want to go. I was really inspired by what you said just now, Brian. It makes me think maybe I should come back and do some schooling here because I feel like that those things that you just described never came up in any of the education I ever got. Now, the thing that we practice at the studio, we call human-centered design. And we have, this is sort of our version of the cute colored graphics you might see describing a process. And I'm sure you might be familiar with other studios and there are other cute colored graphics that describe a process. It all looks very neat, right? And in doing so, I think what can be belie some of the complexity of the work, actually in the phrase itself, human-centered design, might have a hidden conceit that is easy to miss. Because we center on humans, surely it's good for them, right? It must mean that we get given carte blanche to do almost whatever we want because we're human-centered. We can't do possibly any harm. I wish that were always true. This story that I'm going to share with you completely floored me. I had no idea this even existed until a student at the University of Illinois mentioned how he heard about the story coming out of Stanford, the D School, the epicenter for human-centered design and design thinking. I was like, wait a second, are you sure? And I had to do all this secondary research, like, is this for real? And then I realized actually by looking up the stuff, there are several quotes that would cite this. So this quote here is from Bloomberg, because the Juul e-cigarette, and if you're not familiar with what that product is, it's a small product about the size of maybe a USB thumb drive that was a large component of the spread of vaping devices that ravaged this country prior to COVID and was becoming a pretty large, significant public health threat. And this quote here from Bloomberg is notable because on the journey from being graduate students from Stanford they then accidentally found themselves making a product that was supposed to be about smoking cessation, and then whoops, made a $8 billion valuation by Altria because they replaced smoking with something else even more addictive. You know that emoji, this and $8 billion is basically what's going on. So Adam Bones and James Montes were pursuing master's degrees in product design at Stanford when they decided to do something about the smoking addictions, as the quote goes. And these quotes here from Stanford's own alumni magazine, because they're awfully proud of that valuation. Montes and Bones approached smokers on campus and asked them what they loved and hated about their habit. The complaints were consistent: fear of being seen with a cigarette and paranoia about smelling of smoke on a first date. Is that a good insight? Damn. Their first prototypes were ad hoc assemblies of bespoke components and items found on drugstore shelves. They nailed it. They did everything their teachers taught them. They managed to take human-centered design and the observations around humans and their behavior and used it against them. They weaponized it. That blows my mind. And I agree that they were probably trying to do something with good intent, but somewhere along the line, dangled by billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, they said, it'll be okay. We'll just get on the next one. They had the audacity to now, as I've seen this, I took that slide out, of posting a job for a global director of corporate social responsibility. Because of the money that they're making, they're obviously going to make a foundation, obviously. And then I'm sure the foundation will work on products and programs and services that some poor sap is going to end up having to design in an effort to combat the thing that they've just created. That emoji, again. How did we lose our way is the question I have to ask, yet feel so sure we are still on track. What kind of self-narrative do we tell ourselves as designers in the social sector in particular that gets us to be so sure that we are being patted on the back? Is it all the cheerleading we hear around design? Is it the fact that we just sort of like turned off and turned down the right critics? Is it because we just don't want to hear it? Now, it's not as though design is some big single monolith. It's definitely a varied, incredibly complex, and at this point, multifaceted discipline. It started from its roots from at least a couple of hundred years ago. And my practice of the work that I did in industrial design goes back obviously many decades. But the point by now is the fact that all of these sort of limitations and I think liabilities that were in design from the very beginning are being exposed, particularly when it shows up in the social sector. And it's because I think without deliberate intervention, design rarely serves society. Its primary goal was to serve business clients and solve complex business needs in order for those same clients to make more money. That is really all it's ever done. And if design had maybe stayed in its lane, I wouldn't be here on this stage. But designers like myself, I think either because of a feeling like a need to pay down some karmic debt, which I know I have, or because they earnestly want to help, they carry with it a lot of baggage that I'm not totally sure if everyone has taken accounting for. What I noticed as a design professor myself, and as someone who's working in the field, is that I started to notice some gaps and some weird things about myself. I thought, I'm not sure if I'm really ready to do this work, even though we've become like a known entity for leading design work in this sector. So I started to write about the things I've seen. And I tend to do that now, where writing about design education's big gap, understanding the role of power, or trying to figure out how to define what good means in the social sector, are the attempts that I've had of just trying to process what I'm seeing and working out, why am I not getting this? And realizing maybe I'm not supposed to get it. Maybe this is how it was set up. And what I want to do is try to address the gaps myself before asking anyone else to do so. So if you take a chance to take a look at some of their writing, it's because I'm trying to figure this out as I go. And one of the things I noticed, as it says in this first, on the left here, is the idea of how power, as it shows up in design, is very poorly understood and barely discussed at all, which I think is a shame. Now, in design school, when I came up through the 90s in England, and then in the design classes I was starting to teach, design just never came up as a term. It might have at best described who has the ability to maybe set what a project is, but that's about it. So I kind of want to reset, at least for this talk, the scale of power that we think about, rather than being around like world leaders between a Putin and a Biden, but more at the interpersonal scale, because I think it happens here too. And I think it kind of does it a disservice to think about power only by those who are powerful, rather than the interplay that happens between humans at the scale of maybe this class, this talk, and in your classrooms and in your projects. So when we think about those human scales of power, we might miss the things that happen. So to help kind of clarify with the kind of power I'm talking about, I'm going to reference a quote that my co-founder, Sarah, gave me. Her definition for power is the ability to change another person's reality. That can happen through a look, through an email, through a phone call, any number of different vehicles. And I think if you kind of look back, there are probably moments when your reality has somewhat changed 6 months at a time, a year at a time, or more. I'd actually say most of my professional and personal relationships are defined as like markers in my life of moments where power showed up and I felt powerless. Alongside this definition for power, I think it's really helpful to understand in design particular, the second observation, the idea of power asymmetry. Has anyone ever been either like they were in a meeting or they heard about a meeting where they say, wow, there was some really weird power dynamics in the room? Anybody know that? I've never found that phrase to be that helpful other than just describing sounds like a terrible meeting. So power dynamics, it sounds like, well, that's a phenomena, but I don't get a good picture of it. Whereas I think power asymmetry, or the idea that power is lopsided, I find, oh, now I get it. It's a lot clearer to me. Oh, someone had lots of it and someone else had little of it. And that often was me. And just to kind of make this a little clearer, I'm going to visualize it. So there's a pointy triangle laying on the side. And I want to ask, has anyone here ever started a project? And from the very beginning, you can tell you are screwed. Like, I'm never getting out of this alive. The timeline doesn't make sense. The budget's all off. I don't even know who this team is. Have you ever had that? If that was you, and I'd say most of my career was spent in those moments when I find out something like that, that's me or us on the sharp, pointy end of that asymmetry. Can you feel that? The pointy end? That means there's somebody somewhere on the wide end pushing pressure onto us. You may not have known who they were directly, but some shadowy figure definitely was there. So just to kind of take this a little further, I want to highlight how common power asymmetric relationships are. And it's notable in the social sector because so much of what the work that we do actually is predicated by both the presence of power asymmetry and maybe what our role is in it. Here are some classical power asymmetric relationships. We could do a whole talk on just this. Law enforcement with detainees, doctors and patients, employees and employees, funders and grantees, teachers and students, landlords with renters, local government with community, leadership and frontline staff. It's actually an underpinning of those relationships, almost as though both roles come with the asymmetry baked into it. Have you ever felt like some of the places, if you've either been on one or those two sides, does that help maybe articulate why perhaps it felt like you couldn't get out of the mode you're in, almost as though the script was already written for you? What's tough about it, you see, is that because of the asymmetry, there's not a lot of incentive to actually break out of it. The asymmetry almost like propels itself. Now, what's tough is that Greater Good Studio, we were supposed to be like, yeah, fight the man. And we're supposed to be all about the folks on the right pointy side, right? Except where do you think we actually show up when we do our design work? It was a little embarrassing to admit half or over on the left we actually are. We have to get pretty chummy with those with great power in order to do projects at all. I think design as a whole has to get awfully chummy with those with great power. So when you want design work to show up in the social sector, we got to check how close are we getting to the fire here? How much shadow are we sitting in when we say we're doing our work for community? What is the risk actually of making things worse when we show up in community, even though we're supposed to be for them? Because of how our contracts are set up and because of how framing is typically done, and really how asymmetry just exists, how does design play a role of making things actually better rather than just simply making more case studies for us as designers. It's quite problematic, which is why in some cases, we've actually not been able to do the projects at all. And the best time to say no to a project is before it even starts. So let's talk a little about this relationship between client and designer. A lot is embedded in both of those two words. And whether you identify as one or both or neither, I think it's true that those words exist and people play those roles in the world, right? Baggage that comes with both client and designer tends to be based around these kind of these notions. Clients typically have the questions and the money, but the question of what the project is about. And they do it because they come to us as designers because, guess what? We are known to have answers. Our training in schools like this tend to make it possible for us to be readily available where answer making is what we do. It's kind of awesome, actually. But because of that reputation, there's this reputational symbiosis between those who have questions that come to us. It kind of makes sense that there would be an ecosystem around our profession and those who need it. What I'd argue for is that when those relationships are there and they're never questioned, the relationship can typically is about one that is based on execution. I have good quality questions, you have good quality answers, let's go do a thing. And hopefully we get at the end of it, case studies and some impact. That'd be nice, right? What I found, unfortunately, both in the commercial sector and especially in the social sector, is that not every question actually warrants an answer. Not every project really needs to be done by us as designers. Not every project really needs to exist. Sometimes these projects are vanity projects. Sometimes these projects are a distraction. Sometimes these projects are cover. Our training in schools like this and in many others beats into us that we say yes. And if we have any sort of resistance, it's about the nature of the yes. I wish we had more time, more training to say no. And that we had trained not in just the no part, but in understanding the ramifications for that no. I found that actually the fear of all of the fallout from the no is actually scarier than the actual fallout itself. So I wish that we had more practice in that no part, almost as many times as a yes. But we are nowhere near that ratio right now. I'm very proud to say that over the last 10 years as a studio, counterintuitively, I'd say, we have said no a bunch of times, and every time has been terrifying. We've now done about 50 breakup emails over the last 10 years, with the single largest breakup being a $2 million grant that we were greenlit for from USAID. Everything was all set. We were prime. And I didn't even know what that word was, but apparently being prime for USAID contracts means that you get access to other contracts. It would have been millions and millions of dollars worth of work for years. It was nearly impossible to get out of the asymmetry of that contract, just like the other projects we turned down. And we felt like we are set up to fail. We cannot achieve the goals that we have outlined. It won't stand with the principles we have. I just don't think there's any way out of this alive. So when we finally sent the email, which took me 12 months to find the courage for, I feel like actually we saved the studio by not doing the project. This actually is the very first breakup email I ever wrote. It took me 8 hours to write. This is the first breakup email because it was the first time we had anything where we really had to kind of sit and go, what are we doing right now? Surely we have to say yes. My co-founder and I argued all weekend. And it was with RWJF, they're lovely folks, really great. But I was so embarrassed about the idea of saying no. I kept stalling and stalling, going, what am I? I kept saying, who the hell do I think I am? Who am I to say no? And my co-founder, bless her heart, said, of course you're saying no, because who else is going to do it? So what we wrote, which I spent inordinate amounts of time on, turns out that I go back to that structure, and I want to share that structure with you, because there's an underlying logic behind it that I've used again and again and again. And I want to share it with you because I think it's actually a really handy tool. Because the goal is not to piss anybody off. And the other goal is not to look whiny, right? Those are the two extreme options that I know are very available. but rather to actually, hopefully, come back from this and still do projects. So you say thanks because it's nice to be asked. You say no right up front, don't bury the lead and like, put it at the end, because when in case somebody leaves the email, I don't read that part. Explain it's not you, it's me, and then give you a justification. And ideally you say, let's be friends, hopefully we'll try this again. But the justification part I think is really interesting because it has to inquire then, what is bothering me about this question? What is not sitting right about this engagement? What questions still are outstanding that haven't really been satisfactorily been answered? And if you can do that and, like give bullet points, get as many of them out as you can, it helps you avoid the questions of sort of like the obfuscation that happens in an email where things like, it's not a good cultural fit, or we don't have capacity, or this is not a good time right now. All those things were true, but you avoid any inquiry, not necessarily for them, but just the self-inquiry. Why doesn't this sit right with me? And I think if you get practice, which is literally what we're trying to do here, practice clarifying what is not right about this, what doesn't sit right. Do you go, oh, I have some boundaries. Did you know we're allowed to have them? I didn't. I'd never been shown that. I'd only ever been used in any place I'd ever worked. Turns out if you have them, which everybody does, saying them out loud is incredibly healing, incredibly empowering. And it actually starts to tell others, oh, you should have some boundaries too. So let's go back to this relationship, right? The one that was supposedly all about the question and the answer. If we at its root go, yeah, I'm not sure if that is a valid question, and therefore I'm not sure if I really want to participate in that project. What the hell happens then? This whole thing was predicated on question and answer. Now we just blew that up. Well, now what? Do you just sit there awkwardly on the Zoom call? Turns out actually that there might be something else. You might end up having a relationship not based on execution anymore. You've like avoided that. And now you're in a completely new space, a relationship that's based on judgment. Actually, the judgment that you have. Turns out designers have great judgment. We practice it all day on other things, but not on the validity of the question itself. I don't know why. Almost every other major professional discipline, people valued their judgment explicitly. They pay top dollar for those judgments. We discount ours all the time, and I don't get it. I don't know if it's because we don't trust ourselves, or it's because we don't get asked realistically, seriously, what is your judgment? But I'd like to remind us we have it. And that by exercising our judgment, we actually might prevent projects that we know shouldn't exist, go through the whole cycle and end up wasting time, wasting money, and wasting a lot of social capital. As designers, we practice our craft. I think it's the primary thing that we are known for. Alongside those answers tend to be a refinement of what we do, an endless, almost fetishization of what we do as a craft. But I have to wonder, what happens when we reach peak craft? Is that a point that happens? Do we get to that point? Have we already reached it? What happens when we have design schools cranking out thousands of designers every year, going to places like a Facebook or Google or whatever, where you have thousands and thousands of designers practicing craft, practicing craft, practicing craft? Do we get to a point where we've like saturated it, wrung everything we can out of it? Because there was a time where craft was the primary goal because there were so few practitioners. We might be beyond that point now. And we might be now having an interesting sort of lopsidedness where we have people who can do, but not necessarily anybody who's being asked, what should we do? And I think part of the reason why we were heading towards peak craft for so long is I think design has had a chip on its shoulder trying to get to scale for a long time. Do you guys remember this question from a while ago, which is, when are we going to get a seat at the table? Do you remember this? A lot of design leaders were constantly whining about this, like brats. We are at the table, dude. We're good. The problem is we're now showing up at the table, drunk, flip-flops, cut-offs, not realizing we're at so many tables now, and we're just still ready to party. And in that state of readiness of like, let me get to the table, please. I think we've perhaps not realized that design at scale might actually be causing harm at scale because we've been so ready to just get to the next project, treating this project for some vulnerable population in the same way we treat a new personal shopper experience at Nordstrom. They're not interchangeable, but we treat them like so. I would argue that if we keep practicing craft at the pace and scale that we do, I think we're going to start to see diminishing returns on it. I don't know if the people who run design competitions are worried about it, but I feel like there's only so much that we can give out awards for. But I think what we might see and haven't really experienced yet is this untapped potential for judgment. Judicious, careful, thoughtful use of design. As a powerful skill that it is, where both designers like us and design teams that exist are cautiously working as opposed to just going buck wild on everything. More judgment, as in less craft, okay, isn't necessarily bad. I'm not saying we should never talk about craft again. I just want us to stop doing things that are harmful. And my belief is that through judgment, through a careful questioning of should we do this, we might limit the harm. Now, what's really kind of like rhetorically and almost hypothetically difficult is that we'll never know the harm we didn't cause. We can only know about the harms we did cause. And even then, we barely look for them. So I kind of want us to be like, almost assume there is a risk for harm with every project we do. Maybe I'm being a huge downer by saying that. But if we don't admit that there could be a risk, we're never going to be ready to have those conversations about it. Almost every major discipline that has interaction with humans have ethical standards where the risk of harm is present. And because they want to not cause harm, which I think we'd all agree is good, they create interventions to prevent that from happening. We are free and clear of that in design. It's shocking. While everyone is out, like I said, ready to have spring break, I'd like to not be the designated driver all the time. I'd like to not be the Hermione Granger asking everyone, can we all just take a chill, just relax? I'd like some allies in this. I have a few, but I'd like some more. And I think perhaps places like this, Brian, we can rely on to have some folks to be a little sober in all the excitement that we see around how design does its work around the world. But how on earth are we going to be able to do this if we don't actually pause? How will we have the time, like I said, to do some of that no and some of that deep questioning if always what we're doing is forward projection? You know how there's that hustle culture on Instagram and on TikTok and other things where everybody is just constantly making content. No one knows why, but just constantly making it. You can leave with the impression of like, if I'm not constantly making something, I must be doing it wrong. Well, let's take a second to maybe think stock of that and say, I don't think you are. And in fact, let's take a long pause to just try and see what is the work we're doing and then potentially the harms that could come from it. So I'm going to offer these 10 questions because I know I was caught off guard, like I said at the beginning, when they were asked of me, and I felt completely unprepared for them. And because I was unprepared and had no practice, I just got rolled over pretty much like everyone else that got asked it in the studios I've ever worked. Now, it could have been that everyone had that moment, like I talked about, like the title of this talk, where that quiet little voice might have said something. But because they never said it out loud, and because I never said it out loud, all those little quiet voices stayed in our heads alone. I'm pretty sure multiple people were having these questions at the same time, but we all kept mum. So familiarity, as I'm going to try to practice today, is partly so that you can know it before you hit it. And ideally, if you go from that little voice to a medium voice to a loud voice, we don't have to sneak around these ethical questions quite so much. So I'm going to present them in pairs. Are you ready? What is design's relationship to power and privilege? Which humans are we centering when we say human-centered design? How can designers say no to work when they need to pay off their blank? Student debt, medical debt, house, mortgage, rent, whatever. Designers often sink or swim. Why is drowning even an option? Seriously, everywhere I've ever worked, this was completely normalized. It's horrifying, actually, just how violent even just the language around sink or swim is. How do designers decide which people in need to serve? How do we wean design's addiction from whiteness? Why do designers prefer to help people in another country before helping people in their own backyard? Why does philanthropy, not community, set the agenda for social change? What's the cost of speaking up? And what's the cost if we don't? This one I particularly resonate with because I spent a lot of last year debating about whether or not to write a particular letter that I published fairly openly. But I can tell you that the cost of speaking up is dwarfed by the cost of not saying anything for a long, long time. And if any of those weren't already a nightmarish set of questions already, this last one's a real doozy. What right do I have to do this work? So these questions are a nightmare. I'm sorry, they're just impossible. I know. But I also think they're relevant to any designer, particularly ones that are going to be entering complex social issues. I want them to be brought up on a fairly regular basis, not because you're ever going to be able to solve them. That's not the right kind of question they are, but just what do you want to do with this question today? And I think that you can find a lot of solidarity with others when you talk to them about their responses to these questions as well. I don't think it has to be a solitary practice. So going back to this idea of the relationship, one last time. If, let's say, you build a relationship based on judgment, having these ethical discussions that you can with your clients, what happens then? And my co-founder, again, gave me the answer. She said, oh, the relationship that we want are different. We want relationships that are based on sharing of power, both by our clients, by us, towards this redistribution of power to kind of, like we said, restore what was rightfully communities' power in the first place. I found that to be a lovely statement because it was, oh, that's an identifier. We look for clients who want to share their power. Cool. I had no idea you knew that. She apparently sounded this for years. It's like, oh, okay, right. I'm going to use that now. I'm going to find that to be a way to indicate whether or not we should work with this group. Got it. Now, I want to just take a slight sidebar before we wrap up and say that on the journey to this last 10 years of running the business, I've met most of the established leaders that I'm supposed to look to. I've been told to look for their wise, sage wisdom. And I've been disappointed pretty much every time because the questions we have and the questions we just talked about here just fell on deaf ears by those established leaders that I met. It seemed like their questions were rooted in very old models of how design was being done and didn't seem to help me or maybe anybody in this room about what we need. So for those established leaders, I'd like to invite them to take those Lifetime Achievement Awards and gracefully escort them off the stage. We're good. Thank you. Thank you for your service. And for the emerging leaders, perhaps the ones on this call, the ones that are in this room, I'd really like to encourage you to start taking up more space. Those stages need new blood. And if they won't get off the stage, I say, fuck it, start your own stage altogether. We need new voices, we need new people to have the questions and maybe get to those answers that we desperately need for this discipline to grow up and to graduate from where we've been for a long, long time. A small effort towards that was to actually build a database of some of the more progressive design studios that we know of. They're not just studios as well. I actually think it's been notable that the vast multitude of different organization types is also indicative of the multitude of leadership models that exist for this kind of work. So this database that we put together, I'm actually kind of amazed at how much it's grown. We started with about 150, we're now at around 220. And it's stunning to me to see this very vibrant ecosystem that is emerging around us. Our studio is amongst them, but I'm really happy to say that this database now exists, and I'd love for you to go take a look at it. Love for you to see what gaps exist. I'd love for you to look at it and say, hey, look, maybe I should go and give them a shout. Or like I said earlier, realize those gaps exist and I'm going to fill it. And lastly, just as an indication of some of the folks that I look to and learn from, some of which are in the studio, some of which are in the database, but also just are out in the world. I call them my granola bars of hope. It was a funny term that I came up with when I was on an interview one day. But these are the folks that I look to for their leadership, and I look for them for their community. And these are the kinds of people that are indicative of the new forms of leadership that exist, that will exist and become the dominant norm. I think this kind of like balancing, stabilizing force that folks like this provide will, I think, help tip the balance for design in the social sector to end up differently than the way that design in the commercial sector has highly concentrated pockets of power and nobody else. I'd love to encourage you to look up these folks' work, their online profiles, the work that they do, meet them if possible. I just get a lot of hope out of those relationships. So as your homework, and maybe as a prompt for discussion at some point, these are all the questions I had earlier, but I have 2 prompts for you. Which questions have you dealt with recently? And which questions do you expect to deal with soon? I hope that there's a chance for you to get in dialogue with me at some point, and we can talk about it. I can talk about this stuff all day, but I hope that you can find someone else to talk to them about these questions, and it's okay that you don't know how to do it. I think that's the whole point. It's fine. But I think that by simply practicing it, you'll be not as vulnerable as I felt I was when those moments come. I'll be wrapping up now, but thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here in person. Look at this. Woo.